Hello. Welcome to Avenue Park in Stoke Newington in North London. This is 1840s non-denominational chapel, so it'd be a nice backdrop. I wanted to talk to you about a few books that I've been reading. So I'm in a quite fortunate position where I get a lot of these books paid for through work, so I've gone through quite a lot, but I'm going to pick 3 out today that are sort of more focused on a comedian's journey into comedy. So a lot of these sort of autobiographies are sort of, oh, this is, how I grew up and, those kind of things, rather than these are the specific gigs I did and that kind of thing. So the first one is Steve Martin, Born Standing Up. So this is on a lot of the sort of reading list when you start to sort of research which books you might want to read as a stand-up comedian. This is one of the first ones that comes up, along with sort of Frank Skinner and Stuart Lee. She lives nearby, actually, thinking about it. But this one is interesting. Obviously, he's kind of one of the foundational kind of figures in alternative comedy. But it mainly talks about how in the 50s and 60s, growing up in and around kind of Florida, how he kind of got into comedy through sort of magic, and then started doing the coffee house sort of circuit. But there was no sort of circuit for sort of alternative sort of anti-comedy that he was doing. So he, at that time, it was very much kind of set up punchline, and he had to sort of go into rooms where they just didn't really understand why he was doing what he was doing. And he had to sort of just be very persistent and figure out the bits, and there was kind of some banjo stuff that he was doing and that kind of thing. And he just talks about the years of kind of like relentless practice and going in front of audiences that weren't getting it, and sort of the tenacity and the need for the need for that in what he was doing at that time. So that was kind of really interesting from that perspective. The second one I wanted to talk about was Hannah Gatsby's 10 Steps to Nanette, a memoir situation. Most of you will be familiar with Hannah Gatsby and Nanette. That was kind of her breakthrough stand-up hour on Netflix. She's done a couple more other ones after that, which are also really good. But this kind of obviously talks about, there is obviously a larger element of sort of autobiographical element to this book as well, where she talks about growing up in Tasmania and the homophobia that she experienced, and getting a sort of autism diagnosis, and how she kind of like, found getting into comedy, and as one of the sort of only career paths she felt she could sustain, and starting off in a very sort of self-deprecating fashion. But then all those kind of life experiences kind of made her wanted to do something more sort of story-based, something bigger. But the journey she took to really kind of understand and learn the skill sets of sort of tension and release that is a big thing in comedy. So, that was kind of crucial to making the network, and how and if you watch Nanette, the first kind of half an hour, 20 minutes is a bit more standard. There's like much more, the laughs are much more frequent, more kind of classic, but that kind of really gets the audience on side and sort of like gets them trust her. So then she allows her to kind of do some longer, sort of like more sort of poignant bits in the second half, which obviously is where a lot of the gravity from that show comes from. And then she also talks about the sort of fallout of This Is, how that impacted her life, and how she became sort of this household name in a really short period of time, and the impacts that had on her as well. So really interesting, just about kind of like craft. The other thing that comes up in this as well is her background in fine arts, and how that kind of impacted her awareness of kind of narrative and sort of structural devices that kind of come through in the show, which I think is, particularly when you start to talk about like Edinburgh hours, like, understanding that kind of stuff and the various kind of cultural touch points that you can use, I think is going to be really important. And then the last one is Viv Groskop, I Laughed, I Cried. This chronicles her it's late 2011. She does 100 gigs in 100 days. All around the kind of London scene. A lot of the venues that I've sort of already still playing now, a few of them were there at that time as well. But it's kind of like, she's already kind of started in stand-up comedy, and then she wants to sort of really accelerate that development journey, and talks a lot about, when you're first starting out, the challenges and the amount of time it takes to kind of be traveling around London and home counties, just getting kind of 5-10 minutes here and there just to kind of get the stage time. But she's kind of doing it with a young family. Like she's got a really young family at the time she's writing this book, and she talks a lot about the pressures that has on her home life, and the compromises she has to make between not being at home in the evening dealing with the kids and, having a supportive husband that kind of is able to do this. But, as the whole thing progresses, like how challenging that becomes for him. And also obviously talks a lot about, what it was like being a woman in comedy at that time. And, and my understanding is that's gone a little bit better, but it's still a huge problem, or still very challenging. But one of the main things, obviously, he talks about, again, the massive commitment needed to really kind of get that stage time and the, the complexity and, the kind of work-life balance, as it were. But she also really starts to touch upon her realization around persona. And so for her, a lot of it is about, she kind of naturally comes off as quite high status, and maybe some of her material is a bit more low status, and there's a disconnect there for the audience, and that's why it's not necessarily resonating as much. And so, as she kind of gets gigs more and more, and she gets kind of bits of advice and stuff, she gets that awareness of how she needs to be very conscious of the material she's delivering and the persona that she has, in order to sort of like not have a jarring experience and put and immerse the audience, and then ultimately get a better response. And that's kind of something that I'm kind of aware of with some of the older stuff I wrote, not really being in keeping with a kind of awkward sort of persona that I'm sort of working with at the moment. So yeah, 3 really interesting books. I recommend all 3 of these. I may do some others. Main focus aren't reviews. Main focus really is just kind of like my takeaways. But as I kind of move through these videos, and I may do some others where perhaps I wouldn't recommend them as much, but there's still probably an interesting takeaway. Anyway, hope you're well. Thank you. Bye. Next video should be here. Enjoy.